Good morning, dear colleagues. We are once again, as it happens once a year, with our Bible, as they call it, back to you. And I can tell you that this report, like the previous ones, has a lot of interesting insights. And we are going to give you, within the next half an hour, some of the key findings of our study. As we always do, we look at the entire energy sector: oil, gas, coal, nuclear, renewables, energy efficiency, new technologies, and their implications for the global markets. Now, let me start with the how do we see, as a point of departure, today's energy picture from different perspectives. First of all, we are seeing a very strong change in the energy sector, but in different directions. They don't show us signals of one certain direction, in different directions, and this has implications for the different parts of the global energy markets. In terms of oil markets, I think many of you follow very closely. We are seeing that the oil markets are entering a new period of growing uncertainty and volatility. In addition to the changes in the fundamentals, a key factor which does worry me is the growing links between energy and geopolitics. Those links were always there, but they are becoming tighter and becoming even more complex than they were before. So the oil markets, oil security, therefore, is an issue very important, and my colleagues will go through some of the findings and heads up we have for the oil markets. Natural gas, growing very strongly, the fastest growing fuel, and as a result of that, some of the experts were talking about a gas glut in the markets very recently. This gas glut is now being erased thanks to China. As we have, as IEA has already anticipated, ladies and gentlemen, the China effect on the gas markets now is very similar what we have seen 10 years ago, China effect on the oil markets. Similar effect, and we are seeing, as we speak now, China is becoming the largest natural gas importer of the world, overtaking Japan. And this has, of course, huge implications for the gas markets, contracts, prices, and others. Solar PV is growing very strongly as a result of government efforts, as a result of the declining cost, and this year, once again, as a result of the new policies, mainly from China and India, and reduction in the cost, we have revised up our solar expectations. But when we look at the other clean energy technologies, we don't see such an upbeat picture. Wind growth is slowing down. Other technologies, including energy efficiency policies, are rather on the slow track. Now, many of you know the IEA. We have all the energy data in the world at our fingertips. All the energy data in the world. And we look at and we are the only organization, only body in the world which can do it. We look at all the fuels, their consumption, the first 10 months of this year, and resulting emissions from them. And we can now safely say that 2018 CO2 emissions will reach a historical high. This is the highest we have ever seen, and as a result of that, this is not, of course, a good start for the climate change discussions we will have in Poland very soon. And as such, I see a very sharp disconnect between the scientific research, targets, aims we have in terms of climate change, and what is happening in the energy markets. So this is something that also worries us. We have one good news here to share with you. It is the following. Some of you may know, and there are a few colleagues who follow us in that respect as well, since almost 2 decades, we are counting how many people have no access to electricity in the world, in the emerging world. And when we look at our numbers, the year 2000, for example, there were 1.7 billion people who had no access to electricity, 1.7 billion people. And in 2010, it went down to 1.4 billion. And recently, we have seen that this number, for the first time, went below 1 billion people. So less than 1 billion people now have no access to electricity. This big decline, recent decline, is thanks to the great achievement of the Indian government, a country which suffered a lot, having no access to electricity. And now in India, all the villages of India has an access to electricity, which is a good news for India and for the rest of the world. The problem now lies with sub-Saharan Africa, where 2 out of 3 people have no access to electricity. Now, talking about electricity, World Energy Outlook each year looks at all the fuels, as I said, but focuses on one single fuel. This year, our focus is on electricity. Why did we choose electricity? Very simple. First, the electricity consumption is growing very rapidly. 2 times higher than the energy consumption. Energy consumption grows strongly, but electricity consumption grows 2 times higher than the total energy consumption. As a result of digitalization, having more devices, electrical devices at home, industry sector developments, electric buses in the emerging countries, electric cars, among other reasons. We wanted to see that, but plus at the same time, as my colleagues will show you, while electricity consumption grows strongly, the share of renewable energies, solar PV and wind, grows even 4 times higher than the electricity consumption. So there will be growing share of wind and solar in the total electricity generation, which on one hand is a good news for environment, but on the other hand poses some questions in terms of electricity security, how to integrate them in the electricity systems when there is no wind, there is no sun, how we can assure that in the most economic way. And this is how the future power systems should look like, and what kind of measures governments need to take, while on one hand seeing more renewables, on the other hand, how we can create flexibilities, this is the magic word, flexibilities in our electricity systems to make them secure and economic. Now, you will see, as I said in the beginning, there are many trends, there are many numbers and the discussions that we are going to bring to you in a few minutes. But our aim is to say what are the possible outcomes and what are the implications for the governments, citizens, for the industry. We don't claim that we have a monopoly on the truth. We just put the trends and the implications for that and gives a heads up to the governments. And we have today 2 important heads ups, if I may say so, warnings. One is on the oil security. My colleague Mr. Gould is going to talk about that. What happens mid-2020s, the oil security, it's a very important issue for us, what's happening in oil markets. And the second one is on the climate change. Current trends in the energy sector and the climate change targets and the growing disconnect, and my colleague Lara Kozi will tell you about that. So we have looked at them in two contexts. One is our main scenario, which we call the new policy scenario or base case scenario, which looks at the direction of the travel based on the current and planned policy of the governments. And we have a second scenario, which we call sustainable development scenario, which aims to reach the international climate targets, including Paris, which aims to reduce the air pollution in the cities, in big urban centers, a very important issue. And third, which also aims to bring electricity to everybody, universal electricity access. Three so-called SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, established by the United Nations. So two distinct scenarios, but our main discussion will be focused on the new policies scenario, and which is our base case scenario to discuss the trends. And with this, I would like to turn to my colleague, Mr. Gould, please.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. We'll look forward in a minute. Our projections go out to 2040. But what I would like to do first is to rewind the clock back to the year 2000. In energy terms, that was quite a different world. The United States and Europe were the dominant players in global energy demand. And when I start the clock, I invite you to keep your eyes on China, because the big story of the last 17, 18 years was that incredible rapid rise of China in global energy demand, overtaking the United States to become the largest consumer of energy. Now we're going to look forward in our main scenario to 2040. China's growth in the future in this scenario is only around 1/5 of the growth that we've seen since 2000. So what I'd like to invite you to do now is to keep an eye on India, because it's really India that has the largest share of growth in global energy demand as we look forward to 2040. European Union, thanks in large part also to the new efficiency targets that were agreed earlier this year, European Union's demand in 2040 is 20% lower than it is today. And by 2040, Africa is also emerging as a very large global energy demand player, even though, as the Executive Director mentioned, we still have, in 2040 in this scenario, a very large, hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in rural areas, that remain in our projections without access to electricity, and an even larger number without access to clean cooking. So how do we meet this growing demand? Start with the fuel that you can see. We have energy demand rising by more than 1/4. If it wasn't for improvements in energy efficiency, that increase would be twice as large. But after this, the main event is really renewables. Renewables account for 45% of the growth in global energy demand. Lower costs mean that 2/3 of the capacity that we add to the world's power systems comes from renewables. And what that means, allied to other technology developments in storage and so on, coal and renewables essentially switch places in the global power generation mix. At the moment, coal generation is around 40%, renewables in total is around 25%, and between now and 2040 in this scenario, coal moves back from 40 to 25 and renewables tread the opposite path. That has important implications for the emissions from the power sector, and it also has important implications for the way the power systems need to operate, and that's a point that my colleague Laura Kozi will come back to. Next in line is natural gas. Over 80% of the growth in demand comes from developing economies, led by China, as the Executive Director mentioned just now. And the largest single cause of that growth is not the power sector, which is sometimes the first sector that we associate with gas demand. It's actually coming from industry, where gas is an important source of heat, but also an important feedstock for chemicals and other production. Oil. It's true that the stronghold of oil demand in transport is coming under attack from fuel efficiency measures, from fuel switching, including electric cars. And what that means in our projections is that if you just look at oil use for cars, then we see a peak in that segment of oil demand around the mid-2020s. But I like to underline, that's not the whole story for oil. There are many other segments of oil demand that include trucks, that include aviation, that include shipping, that include the use of oil as a petrochemical feedstock, that all see relatively robust growth over the period to 2040. And what that means in practice is that although global oil demand slows, the growth slows, we do not yet see a peak in oil demand overall in that scenario. Finally, coal. Structural decline in advanced economies, but that's offset by some increases in other parts of the world, notably in India and parts of Southeast Asia. I would just note that in the case of China, in our view, has reached the high point in its own coal consumption. That declines to 2040 by an amount that is greater than the European Union's coal consumption today. Finally, I would just like to point out that this is really a flow issue. This is the way that we meet incremental demand. And a large part of that comes from lower emissions options. But that's flowing into a system that remains heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So at the moment, fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas account for some 81% of primary energy demand. That goes down in this scenario, and because of the developments that you're seeing on the screen, but it goes down to 75%. So you have some progress, certainly, but we need to keep in mind also the inertia of the system, and that's a topic that we'll also come back to a bit later on. I'd like to turn to oil markets now. As the Executive Director mentioned, we do have concerns that we may be, although we have some evidence of comfortable supply for the moment, that picture might change tomorrow. And the focus here is very much on the mid-2020s. We put the oil demand outlook on the screen from our new policy scenario. That's roughly an addition of 1 million barrels per day per year between now and 2025. And the question that we ask ourselves is, where is that demand, where is that supply going to come from? As always, the need for new investment in all scenarios is not dictated by the demand trajectory, but it's really about compensating for declines from your existing fields. And so the task is to fill that gap that we see there between declining demand from declining supply from existing fields and that demand outlook. Part of this wedge here, we can consider that it's in the bank. It's projects that have already been approved that will ramp up between now and then. But we also need to consider how many new conventional projects will be coming on, because here you see everything except US shale. And what concerns us is that since 2014, we've had 3 years when that flow of new conventional projects has been at a rate less than half of what we saw for the previous decade to 2014. And if there is no pickup in that rate of investment, then we will be asking an awful lot of US shale to fill the remaining gap. we already incorporate in our main scenario very strong growth in US shale. But indeed, if there is no pickup in conventional project approvals, that would mean that output of liquids from US shale players would need to grow to more than 20 million barrels a day by 2025. That's more than 10 million barrels a day additional from where we are now. And that's really, what that would mean in practice is that we would need to continue the unprecedented levels of growth that we've seen in recent months, not just for a year or two, but consistently out to 2025. In other words, the United States alone would need to add another Russia to global supply by 2025. With a sufficiently large resource base, we don't exclude that possibility, but it would require a level of capital investment and a number of tight oil rigs that would far surpass previous peaks. A few words on natural gas, which does well in our projections, but we have some significant changes for this year's World Energy Outlook compared with last year. One of those relates to the European Union. Our gas demand numbers for 2040 in the new outlook are some 50 billion cubic meters lower than in the World Energy Outlook 2017, and that's in large part due to the new renewables and efficiency targets that were agreed earlier this year. Although the impact on trade, which is the subject of this slide, is mitigated by the fact that we've also incorporated a downward revision to the EU's own production. But the biggest change in our projections this year relates to China. That's an upward revision, and gas is a good fit for China's policy preferences, including growing attention to the quality of growth, the quality of air, and the needs of China's growing cities. We do have questions about the speed at which some of the infrastructure will be built out, including gas storage, but in our view there are very strong underpinnings for rapid growth alongside low carbon technologies. And what that means is that when we look at the gas trade picture, China dominates the increase in demand for traded gas, such that gas imports to China reach the levels of those to the European Union. This is a policy-driven development in global energy to a large degree. It is a strategic choice that's been made by China. It's not necessarily a choice that is matched in other parts of Asia, other developing countries in Asia, and that's why you don't necessarily see the same developments across that region. But what it means in terms of global gas markets is that the pendulum swings. At the moment, long-distance trade in gas is still dominated by pipelines, but more than 80% of the growth comes from LNG, and so that means that by 2040, LNG becomes the predominant way to move gas over long distances. Up until recently, we were concerned about the relative paucity of new investment projects on the gas supply side, the liquefaction projects. Those concerns have been eased over the last few months. Qatar has made big new announcement of its own expansion plans. The major new investment that's been announced in Canada has also helped in that regard. But a common denominator for those last two slides have been some concerns and discussions about the adequacy of investment. And indeed, for our projections, investment is a crucial variable for energy security, but also for the prospects to shift the energy system onto a different trajectory. Huge needs over the coming decades. That's more than $2 trillion each year just in energy supply, and there's a lot more that needs to be spent on improvements in energy efficiency, electric mobility, and so on. But the point that we wanted to emphasize here is that governments have a critical role in determining where that capital investment goes. Around 70% of the investment in energy supply comes from state-directed enterprises, or it responds directly to regulation that offers a partial or full revenue guarantee to the investor. Auctions for renewables, biofuels investment, pipeline investment, all the investment done by national oil and gas companies around the world. That's what feeds into that calculation. And only a relatively small share involves private companies taking on full market risks from the oil price, say, or from wholesale electricity prices. And what that means is that the pathway that energy systems follow in the future depends to a very large degree on governments and their policies. It also means that a rapid energy transition is not inevitable, it is a path that needs to be chosen. And as we'll now discuss in relation to electricity, this is a major consideration when we look at the future reliability and sustainability of the electricity system.
So, thank you very much, Tim. We now switch to the special focus that our executive director mentioned at the beginning, electricity. Why did we focus on electricity this year is really quite simple. I'm sure that in a little while, many of you will start looking for plugs to connect your computers, your phones. Our economies are becoming more and more digital and electric. But at the same time, the power sector that is actually 100 years old is undergoing the most dramatic transformation since its beginning. Why it's that? Is a combination of technology and policy push that has brought into the mainstream variable renewables. Variable renewables are a very different beast in providing electricity. By definition, they are variable. They don't provide electricity all the time we need it. So they are really calling for a very dramatic transformation of electricity systems. The third reason is that more and more investment are actually flowing into this sector. Last year, for the second year in a row, there were more money flowing into the power sector than into fuel supply. So here we are looking for the first time into this sector in depth. And I'll take you through three of our key main findings. First of all, what does it mean increasing variable renewables for the electricity sector per se? Second, what's going to happen to nuclear, who is the other main low-carbon source of electricity? And third, how far can you really electrify our economies? So, the executive director mentioned this. Electricity demand is growing strongly, but variable renewables are growing 4 times stronger than electricity demand. This means that we are expecting, for example, solar to become the second largest capacity, surpassing coal, that has been the stronghold of electricity supply for a century, surpassing coal as main capacity, source of capacity. It means that in many cases, when the sun goes down, this peak capacity and generation coming from coal will swing down, while probably in many developing countries, cooling peak demand is coming up. So the system will have to cope with this mismatch, with this flexibility. So for us, the key theme of the future of electricity is flexibility. Now, at low level of variable renewable penetration, like we are seeing today in India, in China, in the United States, it's easy to accommodate these shares of variable renewables. The system is able to take care of it. We operate a bit differently. Natural gas power plants, coal-fired power plants, and we do take care of those smaller shares of variable renewables. As the shares grows, you need dedicated investment. What are those dedicated investments? They can take different forms. It could be transmission lines. It could be increasingly storage. But what we see very clearly is that everyone is moving up the share of variable renewables. The need for flexibility will quadruple. It means that storage will have to be there and will have to be made available to the system. It means that increasingly demand-side response will need to be available for the system. Are we ready for that? What we find is that we need to, together, to have a value for electricity, increasingly value flexibility, to ensure that timely investments are made to make the most efficient and effective and economic use of this increasing variable renewable. What's happening to nuclear? So nuclear currently represents around 10% of generation globally. In major markets, the United States, Europe, and Japan, the share of nuclear today is much larger than that. It's around a quarter. But 2018 is an important year for nuclear in these countries. It celebrates 40 years old. Why is 40 years old important? It's because when most of the reactors were designed, actually it was the nameplate design for those reactors. It means that the majority of the power plants, the nuclear power plants that are currently installed in those regions, are seeing the end of their lifetime, which means that if policymakers do not extend the lifetime of those reactors, by 2040, the share of nuclear will have gone down significantly, accounting for only 5% of generation by 2040. This has implications on two accounts. First, on electricity security, and it goes back to the flexibility issue we put forward just a second ago, and the second on decarbonization, because the power sector is at the forefront of decarbonization, but losing this important part of a low-carbon generation will have additional strain to keep up with decarbonization targets. This is one direction. We have a completely different one in another part of the world. China, Russia, India. Going forward, we do expect a very, very large increase in nuclear power installation in those countries. It means, for example, that China would have a nuclear power generation installed larger than the United States within a decade, and India a larger nuclear power generation capacity, larger than Japan within the same time frame. Very clearly, two different directions in different parts of the world. Now we come to our executive director mentioned at the beginning. We have two main scenarios, our new policy scenario and the sustainable development scenario. But when we look at the new policy scenario, there is really one key uncertainty for us, and is really electrification. How much more strongly can electrification grow? And we do think it's actually quite plausible that electricity will grow faster than it does in our new policy scenario. Why is that? For a number of reasons. We may all go, our economies may go digital much more quickly than we are currently expecting. We may have many more things connected to the internet in our homes than we are expecting in our new policy scenario. That's perfectly plausible. Electrification of the 1 billion that is currently deprived could actually go faster than we are expecting. There are other reasons. There are technology cost declines. Heat pumps, for example, are declining their cost very quickly. That could lead a faster electrification of heat. This is what is happening in China. In the fight for pollution, heat and electrification of heat is at the cornerstone. And third, we are seeing in many cities a push for electromobility. Electric buses in China and elsewhere is becoming competitive with conventional buses, and cities pushing very strongly for that. And in European cities, more and more, we hear the wish to, over time, ban conventional cars. So we have asked ourselves, okay, how far can electrification go, and how far, what would it mean for the energy system at large? So this is the demand growth in electricity. There are not many straight lines in the book, but this is really certainly one of them, growing very strongly. If we were to go with this scenario that we call the future is electric, electricity demand would grow more strongly. How much is that more strongly? By the end of the period, you have added a United States and a Europe in terms of global consumption. That's large. How much is it in terms of energy uses? Are we electrify everything? Not really. We can't. So today we have 20% of our energy use that are electrified. If we were to electrify everything that is technically possible, that would be 70%, because we still don't know how to do long-distance planes and long-distance ships with that. How much is this that we are seeing plausible? Is around 1/3. Is 30-35% of end uses can be electrified. What is the implications for the global energy system? First, we would see a peak in oil demand which is not in our main case, it would appear by around 2030. Why is that? It's a combination of two things, and both have to happen. On one hand is electrification of it, our homes being electrified and much more than is today, and electromobility, buses, scooters, electric vehicle. And this, a combination of the two, would lead 50-50, the reason broadly split, would lead to a peak in oil demand by 2030. What would happen to other parts of the energy system? For gas demand, we wouldn't see much of a difference, because what you take out, for example, for heating, you would need to use in the power sector to produce the extra demand. Renewables would grow even more than in our main scenario, so with additional strains for flexibility. Local pollution in cities would improve significantly. Overall, 2 million premature deaths avoided. This is a very important finding. However, in many cases, we do electrify, and we do tend to think that electrification equals decarbonization. Well, we want to put a bit of a question mark here. Our finding is that if you go on with this path, even if the rate of renewables is twice as fast what we have been seeing over the past 5 years, the runaway electrification here wouldn't lead to meeting our climate goals. It's only 1% different from our main scenario. Why is that? Renewables and other low-carbon technologies are not keeping up with the pace of electrification. So if we want to decarbonize and electrify at the same time, a further push on low-carbon technologies on the power sector would be required. Now, before giving back the floor to our executive director, I would like to spend the second to last slide onto, are we on track to meeting our climate goals? So in our main scenario, there is no two answers about it. The answer is no. We don't see a peak in energy-related CO2 emissions, and this is the prerequisite for any long-term stabilization of emissions. As our executive director says, what we have done here is an X-ray of the energy system and tried to really went down and boil down why are we not meeting our climate goals. And we identified here two reasons. The first thing that we looked at is existing infrastructure. So is this building, all the power plants that are out there, the factories, and everything that is being built. And how much this infrastructure, built-in infrastructure that we have, is emitting today and will continue to emit in the future. Why will it continue to emit? Because lifetime of energy infrastructure in general is long. This building probably was created, I don't know, many years ago, but it's not going to be destroyed in a couple of years. It's going to stay here for many years. Similar with power plants and so on and so forth. So this existing infrastructure has this emission profile. So we are emitting today around 32 gigatons, and in 2040, this very existing infrastructure will still emit 18 gigatons. Now you may ask yourself, is this a lot? Is it little? Well, it happens to be very, very close to the emission trajectory that we would need to do, we would need to be in if we were to meet our climate target. That green trajectory is the scenario that the executive director mentioned at the beginning, the sustainable development scenario that is fully aligned with Paris. So the gap between what the current infrastructure will continue to emit if operated as we are operating it today is equivalent to 1 year of emissions over the next 20 years, which means any strategy that wants to meet the Paris Agreement has to focus on one hand on what are we building new, but importantly, we need to act on the built-in infrastructure. If we don't act on that, we will not make it. What does that mean? For example, these beautiful buildings, it would mean that we would need to retrofit it to make sure that it goes to net zero energy. We can do more, of course. The single largest lock-in emission that we have today is coal-fired power plants. Coal-fired power plants globally account for 1/3 of emissions, and they are, most of them, young teenagers and below. So half of the existing coal-fired power plants is below 15 years old, which means it will stay with us for many, many years. So what is the strategy to deal with those, to create more space to emit? Well, we need new technology, we need innovation, we need carbon capture, utilization, and storage, we need more efficient operations, we need other ways to use our existing infrastructure better.
So, this, of course, as Mrs. Cozy mentioned, making the CCS and other technologies, we can create more room for the other new investments that we can have throughout the next years. And it is very important from the government's point of view that we need to also look at the existing technologies, how we can improve, how we can get the best out of them, as Mrs. Cozy mentioned. Now, let me finish our verse by telling you that, once again, reiterating that we are worried that the links between energy and geopolitics are getting tighter and becoming even more complex. As such, we believe energy security is a key issue for today and also for tomorrow. It is not only an issue of yesterday. Second, as Mr. Good highlighted to us, there is a mismatch between the robust oil demand growth next 7 years or so vis-a-vis the fading appetite for new investment in the oil sector wherever you go, except for shale. But shale alone can do a lot, but it cannot do everything. To expect that the shale, in this context, bringing in 7 years over 10 million barrels per day of additional oil is a tall order. Shale bringing in another Russia itself is a tall order. We don't exclude that this cannot happen, but if it happens, it will be the first time in the history of oil that in such a short period of time, so much oil will come to the markets. And therefore we thought we give a heads up to the oil industry, producing and importing nations, before it is too late to see the looming challenges in the next few years to come. The electricity is growing very strongly, so are the renewable energies, intermittent renewables, and we have to tell the governments, we are going to tell the governments as of today, it is good that many of the governments, more than 150 countries around the world, providing incentives for the renewable energies, for wind and solar and the others, for the sake of the economics, reducing air pollution, addressing climate change. But another task comes to them now, to have the incentives, investment, to create flexibilities which will be needed in order to address the challenges coming from the increasing share of these renewables. Again, as my colleague Mrs. Cozy mentioned, currently emissions are in a very solid track of increase, which brings the hopes for a quick peak and going down very little. And we cannot leave everything here to renewables. This year and last year, renewables additions were record high, but so were the CO2 emissions. If we think renewables can solve all the problems, it will be not right. Then we need other technologies such as CCUS, hydrogen, and also storage, which can also accelerate the growth of renewables, are very important. Finally, looking at in my view, the most telling chart we have shown you, that the 70% of all energy investments are government-driven, either directly by a state enterprise or responding to government regulations, tells us that the destiny of our energy future lies with the governments. And of course, the companies responding to oil price changes, responding to electricity price changes are important, but they are about 30% of the building our infrastructure. 70% comes from the governments, therefore big responsibility for the governments, and we thought as International Energy Agency, an intergovernmental organization, it is a point that we should discuss with governments as of today. Now, Jet, this is our presentation, and happy to get some comments and questions from our colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Birol. We're going to take some questions by three, so I'll pass the microphone. If you could just introduce yourselves, please, and your organization. I'll start with this side of the room.
I'm John Mannering from Energy Intelligence. How would you advise the oil companies to play the energy transition, given that you are warning of a supply crunch by 2025, and then also warning that if electrification takes place in a more rapid fashion than you've outlined in your new policy scenario, there may be peak oil in 2030? Thanks.
Ronan Kavanagh, Energy Intelligence as well. Would you talk about this mismatch between the Paris goals and kind of where we're headed? What role do you think governments need to play in kind of helping to kind of meet both the Paris goals and keep the lights on? Do we need stronger responses from kind of international and national levels?
Junior Ross with the Energy Industry Times. You say there right at the end you need other innovative technologies, including storage, CCUS, and hydrogen. We've not seen a lot of success with CCUS, but looking at those three things you mentioned there, have you got any views on which ones are the most likely to play the key role?
Perhaps I will start first and ask my colleagues to comment as well. Now, first of all, to just look at the cars, what's happening in the automotive sector, and from there extrapolating what will happen in the global oil demand is not the right way to go. And even in the context of climate change as well. Let me give you two numbers. Today, cars account about 20% of the total oil consumption, 80% somewhere else. Okay. So therefore, we see that there will be a peak for the car oil demand, but this is the peak of the 20%. Still very strong growth. It is driven by the petrochemical sector, followed by trucks, followed by ships, followed by jets, and the others going very strongly. So we do not see anytime soon a peak of oil demand growth. This is number one. Number two, the oil fields, I think there are colleagues who knows better than us here, oil fields are like the human beings. When they are almost, we have the data for 5 decades, now the global investment for electricity are higher than the oil and gas sector. So I think why the international oil companies are investing there, they see that there is money coming from there, and the diversifying their portfolio is a good news. But once again, we will need oil for many years to come. We like it or don't like it, this is another story, but this is what the numbers show, especially for the aging of the existing fields. which are more important than the demand growth itself. Now, what needs to be done to reach the international climate targets? Two things. One, if the countries or the world is serious to reach the Paris target, first, the new investments in the energy sector should be sustainable investments, sustainable energy. Second, more importantly, we have a huge chunk of energy infrastructure today already locked in. Power plants. We have in Asia today existing and under construction close to 2,000 gigawatts of coal. Average age is 11 years old. 1/3 is subcritical. What are we going to do with that? In my view, I will come to the question, because CCUS is a major way of looking at this issue. So therefore, governments need to, first of all, the new investments should be sustainable investments, and second, this is not enough. Second, we have to intervene to the existing infrastructure, how we can retrofit it, how we can make it more friendly. Now, but once again, I wanted to say that we have targets, we have scientific research, the IPCC, United Nations, and so on. They are giving us deeper and deeper targets in terms of emissions, but there is a very strong and growing disconnect what happens in the energy markets in the underground and what is happening in those targets. Third point, which technologies? There are many of them, and Mrs. Kozi mentioned the hydrogen, CCUS, and storage. Storage is very important. Hydrogen is coming very strongly. Japanese government, for the G20 next year, put a focus on the hydrogen energy and asked the International Energy Agency to brief and support the world leaders on the hydrogen possibilities and economics of that. And we are working on this together with Japanese government and as well as with other governments. In terms of CCUS, very critical technology, because we have a huge, still, as Mr. Gould mentioned, even in the future, 3/4 of our energy will come from fossil energy. Why? They are stable, cheap, convenient, among others. So CCUS is a technology which links our climate goals and our existing infrastructure and the economics of energy. So we see some good signals. I am not as pessimistic as some are. We see some signals. United States government has a new tax credit for the CCS projects, 45Q, very important one. UK, Netherlands, China, Norway, many other, Canada are pushing the CCS very strongly. And you know, we have a COP meeting coming, a very important climate change meeting. Just before that, 1 week before that, the UK Minister of Energy and Climate Change, Minister Claire Perry, and myself invited the leaders of energy sector to Edinburgh on 28th of November to a CCUS, International CCUS Summit, where we have many ministers and CEOs of the leading energy companies, oil, gas, coal, together to discuss how we can make the CCUS, first of all, much more penetrating the technological markets, and plus how we can send a message to the climate community in a COP meeting in December. We are very happy that the president of COP, our Polish colleague, Minister Kurtyka, will be also attending this meeting together with the Scottish Prime Minister, among other dignitaries. So it's an issue that the IEA takes very seriously, CCUS. It's a way to, I believe, to look at the future.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take 3 more questions. I'll just go this way.
Thank you. Nick Coleman from Platts. I have 2 oil-related questions, if I may. Under the new policy scenario, you're not particularly optimistic about Russian oil production. It sort of plateaus and then starts to fall away a little. Do you expect sanctions and other barriers to investment to persist right out to 2040 in Russia? And my other question, if you don't mind, is about Iran. The impact of reinstating sanctions last week has probably been less than many people feared. Do you expect the impact of those sanctions to intensify for the oil markets, or in fact to sort of relax and become less important? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Lopez from ICIS News. We cover the petrochemical industry. And petrochemicals feature heavily on this report you published. So I wonder what that will mean for feedstocks like naphtha, ethane, LPG, and the prices of those feedstocks. As well, you mentioned recycling on your report, but you don't seem to be too optimistic. You think the increased recycling rates won't lead to a lower demand from crude oil, so that we will basically keep putting our plastics in landfills. So what's your opinion on that? And thanks.
Hi, my name is Oliver Edelman. I'm from Platts also. I had a couple of questions on nuclear. It's kind of everyone's relying very much on Chinese growth to sort of power, as you say, bring new production to the industry. My understanding is there hasn't been any new construction starts since late 2016 in China. So I'm just wondering if you had any view on that, and you think there's potentially a serious issue there, because if there was any delay in the kind of rate of growth of China, I think the whole industry would be in very serious trouble. Yeah.
Perhaps, Mr. Good, you want to go for Russia, and Mrs. Kozy for Petchem. I take my favorite question of Iran.
So thanks very much for the question. I'll just say a couple of words on Russia. Indeed, I mean, Russian production over the near term has relatively buoyant, but the questions that we ask ourselves when we look out into the 2020s and beyond is, you know, what do you do when you exhaust the possibilities to get the best out of your existing brownfields? You know, at what point are you able to bring on new greenfield investment, which is going to be in more difficult areas, and you are going to need to look at some remote parts of eastern Siberia. You're going to need to look at some areas that are technologically complex. And when we consider the prospects for developing those kinds of fields, we don't, of course, have a view on the duration of the current restrictions on technology transfer or financing, but that plays into some concerns we have about how quickly the Russian side may be able to develop those kinds of challenging new resources. And I think that helps to explain the trajectory for oil supply production that you've outlined.
Okay, Ms. Kozy, the Petchem and the nuclear.
So on Petchem, so you've seen in this report, but we've also released earlier this year a special focus on petrochemical. And for us, the analysis is really unmistakable. Demand for oil for petrochemical reasons is gonna grow, and we did look in details at the question of recycling rates, plastic reuse, as this has become a very, very topical issue in many geographies. However, the potential for demand growth for plastics in regions of the world such as India, really most of Asia, the plastic use currently is very low compared to the standards that we're seeing in our economies. Even doubling the current recycling rate as we're seeing it, which would mean globally having everywhere on the planet, Sub-Saharan Africa, everywhere, recycling as much as we do in Europe, which is around 35%, would not curb oil demand growth. So for us, certainly a very welcome thing to push for recycling and the ban of single plastic use, but per se would not be enough to bend the curve for petrochemical demand and for oil demand in general. On the question on China nuclear, it is indeed correct that we follow the same, we track the same trend. Our understanding, however, is that there is new technologies being developed, and actually the ground is laid for several new construction to start, and we do expect this to start keeping up very soon again. There is we don't see any real decline in appetite from the Chinese government in pushing for nuclear and a host of less polluting technologies, mostly for what was mentioned earlier, local pollution reasons. There is a real clear direction of the government of wanting to clean up the cities, and this is clearly part of, nuclear is clearly part of this, of this reducing air pollution.
And finally, on Iran, Iran's exports compared to the peak in the summer went down. According to our latest numbers, about 900,000 barrels per day went down. And the expectation, the markets were higher, as you mentioned, in terms of the sanctions put there. But for us, how the next steps in terms of sanctions and the exceptions given there is a major uncertainty. Are we going to see the same regime in terms of the sanctions, or it's going to be tighter? Is a very important area. And let's do not forget that when we look at the entire oil markets, the spare production capacity is thinner and thinner now compared to a couple of months ago. We shouldn't forget that context as well.
Okay, we're going to go one more round.
Yeah, just to follow up on that question, this is Kelly Gilbum from Bloomberg. Dr. Birol, you said a few weeks ago at Oil and Money that the oil market was in a red zone, and I was wondering if you still think that it is, and if you can give a little bit more of your thoughts behind that.
Hello, Judith from Spanish Agencia EFE. First of all, please could you clarify that oil is still 80% of energy demand growth, whether you see or not a peak in oil demand, because I heard a couple of different things. And then could you pinpoint the countries that would need more investment to avoid the crunch? And also, are you worried in any way that the US could play such a pivotal role in the mid-20s? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Patrick Sachs from ISIS. A question on LNG. You mentioned geopolitical tensions. The perhaps obvious example is trade tensions between the US and China. We've seen that, in theory, delay FID on one LNG project recently, Magnolia. I wondered if you saw a broader risk to the supply side of the LNG market from that. And secondly, one of the interesting insights I thought was you mentioned in the report that around 40% of European regas capacity was not accessible to neighboring states. And yet we see countries like Germany, Croatia looking into new regas capacity. Do you think instead the answer is just increased pipeline capacity within those countries?
So I will look after the Bloomberg question, and Tim, you can oil 80%. There must be a misunderstanding there. You may want to correct it, and I will talk about the LNG as well. So yes, when the oil prices were $86, we said that oil prices are entering a red zone for the global economy. And I appeal to key oil producers to increase the production so that the global economic growth, which is already is a weak momentum, is not negatively affected, especially for the emerging countries such as India, such as China, such as several developing countries, and who are the main drivers of global energy and oil demand. But the good news is, and then we talk with many of the key oil producing countries, ministers, the OPEC Secretary General and the others, and I am pleased to see that they responded our calls and the calls of the others positively, and to their credit, they comfort the markets with bringing more oil today. Now, the prices are today from 86 down to 70. I think it will be not the right thing to do to push the prices up against those levels that when we talk about the red zone in terms of the economic growth. This is the, I believe, the key producers have behaved responsibly in the last few months, which is much appreciated. I am sure that they will have the same position when it comes to the current price levels. Very high prices are not good for, definitely for consumers today, but not good news for the producers tomorrow. So we should be all aware of that. Then about LNG. Now, Mr. Good mentioned the China gas and the bulk of the China gas growth in terms of demand is met by LNG. And here, there are three major champions now in the 2 years of time in the Champions League. We've had up to now only Qatar, we will have US and Australia. Three of them at the level of 100 BCM of export capacity, and they are going to bring more flexibility to the markets. They are bringing the contracts will be shorter, and the final destination clause will be less and less pronounced in the new contracts. These are all providing flexibility. Now, on one hand, US is emerging as a major LNG exporter. On the other hand, China is emerging as the major gas importer. And as you rightly mentioned, there are some discussions between those countries in terms of the disputes, in terms of trade. Trade disputes were here yesterday, they'll be here tomorrow between different countries, but I firmly believe that the gas LNG from US or Australia or elsewhere will find the way to the LNG-hungry markets, including China, India, and elsewhere. With this, perhaps I turn to Mr. Good for the 80% oil, which I guess is not the right number.
I'm assuming that the 80% may be a reference to the share of fossil fuels in primary energy demand. So we have a situation today that if you look at the primary energy used across the energy system, then oil is around 32% of that, coal is 27%, gas 22%. Together that makes up that 81%. Now, there's a respectable argument that primary energy is not the right metric to measure the contribution of renewables, but as an indication of the overall orders of magnitude of contributions to meeting global energy, I think that's where that 80% comes from. Now, in our new policy scenario, oil demand goes up, the growth slows, but it is still rising slowly when we reach 2040. And there's different things at play there. And we talked about one component of that, which is the car segment, which, as has been mentioned, that's less than 1/4 of oil demand. And that rises to the mid-2020s and then falls away. But there are other sources of growth, which are mentioned: trucks, aviation, shipping, petrochemical feedstocks, that keep that upward momentum going. the share of oil in the global energy system decreases. So that goes from 32 to some 28% in 2040. And that's because other things are growing more quickly. But in absolute terms, oil continues to grow. And you asked about the countries that might need to put more investment in our analysis. Just to put some numbers on what we've talked about earlier. In a typical year between 2005 and 2014, you would have, for new conventional oil projects, around 16 billion barrels of, 19 billion barrels of resources approved for development each year. That rises and falls, but I mean that's the average over that period for new conventional oil projects. Since 2014, we've had 2015, 2016, 2017, and looking at the numbers also for this year, that has fallen from 19 to around an average of 8 billion barrels. So it's fallen by more than half. And that's the issue that we have when we look over the next few years, that if that doesn't pick up, then we are relying very heavily on US shale to, in a sense, to pick up the slack. 8 billion barrels, as it happens, would be sufficient to meet demand in our sustainable development scenario. But that has a demand profile which gets back to roughly where we are today by 2025. In the new policy scenario, with that rising trajectory, something else needs to happen, and so that's why we think there needs to be a pickup also in this component. Where does it happen? The Middle East is a significant part of that, but there are other offshore and deep water projects that are also come through in our projections there. There was a question about Europe, about the ability to get gas away from regas facilities across borders. Indeed, the number that you quote is from the analysis that we've done in the gas chapter. And what we looked at in particular is what contribution can a more interconnected European single market make to gas security in the future. And indeed, one of the solutions that we look at is, it's not necessarily a question of infrastructure, but it is a question of ability to move gas freely around the European single market. And one of the interesting and important outcomes of that is that those gas molecules, if they're traded across national borders, they start to lose, in a sense, a national identity connected to the supplier. They become molecules available on a liquid market that are then available to consumers as they are needed. And in our view, particularly in parts of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, that ability to participate in a liquid, well-interconnected market, it makes an important contribution to the gas security equation.
So, just to finish our press conference, we see two looming challenges and risks for all of us, for the world. One is the oil security, oil markets challenge in the mid-2020s. We are seeing this challenge coming very strongly, as mentioned by Mr. Gould. And the second one is mentioned by Mrs. Kozi. There is a big disconnect between our Paris international climate targets and what is happening in the energy sector, energy markets today on the ground, and the decisions being taken. And these are all described in the World Energy Outlook and what kind of advices we have for the governments. And to finish, I just got the good news from the office that the World Energy Outlook, as you know, it is the best-selling energy book in the world. The sales numbers this morning confirm that we will be again the best-selling energy book in the world, and you can please enjoy your free copies here. Please take it home, and thank you very much for coming here.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming to our press conference. Thank you.